Duluth, Minnesota. November 3rd, 1883. While his neighbors patched their shingle roofs and stacked cordwood for the coming winter, Finnish immigrant Antti Lahti climbed onto his newly completed cabin and began constructing something that made absolutely no sense: a second roof, 18 inches above the first one, complete with its own rafters, its own shingles, its own ridge beam. 2 full roofs on a single cabin, separated by nothing but dead air and a grid of support posts. His neighbor, Samuel Morrison, who'd homesteaded the adjacent 160 acres 3 years prior and survived 2 brutal Minnesota winters, stood in his yard, shaking his head. "Auntie, that's a waste of good lumber," he called out. "You've already got a perfectly sound roof. Why in God's name would you build another one on top of it?" Auntie didn't stop working. He just smiled, that quiet smile his neighbors had learned meant he wasn't going to explain himself. Not yet. Morrison wasn't alone in his bewilderment. Catherine Fletcher, the settlement's school teacher who'd come from Boston with her merchant husband in 1880, watched from her porch with open concern. "That man is going to collapse his entire structure," she told her husband Thomas that evening. "The weight of those timbers, the snow load come January. He's built himself a death trap." Thomas Fletcher agreed. He'd served as the township's volunteer building inspector and considered himself knowledgeable about frontier construction. "Double the roof means double the weight, double the maintenance, double the expense. It's damn foolishness." Even Magnus Johansson, a Swedish homesteader who generally defended his fellow Scandinavian immigrants against Yankee criticism, couldn't make sense of it. "I've built in Stockholm, I've built in Wisconsin, I've built here in Minnesota," he told the men gathered at Swenson's general store. "Never seen anything like it. If he wanted better insulation, he should have added thickness to his walls or packed the attic with sawdust like everyone else. A second roof? That's not going to keep you any warmer, and it's going to cost twice the shingles." What did Antti Lahti understand about heat loss and thermal dynamics that his experienced, educated, well-meaning neighbors had completely missed? Before we reveal exactly how this double roof design would save children's lives within 3 months, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever seen traditional building techniques that seemed crazy until they proved themselves brilliant. The specifications of Antti's absurd construction were precise and, to conventional thinking, entirely wasteful. His primary roof was standard frontier design: rough-cut pine rafters at 24-inch intervals, 3 to 4-inch pine boards nailed perpendicular as decking, covered with cedar shingles laid in proper overlapping courses. Nothing unusual there. Every cabin in the settlement had something similar. But then, mounted on 8-inch square posts that extended vertically from the cabin's main structural frame, Antti built a complete secondary roof system. The posts created exactly 18 inches of clearance between the underside of the upper roof's decking and the top surface of the lower roof's shingles. The upper roof matched the lower in pitch, span, and shingle pattern. From the ground, it looked like someone had taken a normal cabin roof, lifted it 18 inches into the air, and just left it there floating above the original. The gap between the 2 roofs was unobstructed, except for the support posts. No insulation, no packing material, just open air circulating freely through the 18-inch cavity that ran from eave to eave. Morrison examined the construction up close when Antti invited him to inspect the work. "I'll grant you the craftsmanship is solid," Morrison admitted, running his hand along the joints where the support posts met the rafters. "But Antti, this is 18 extra inches of height that's going to catch the wind. You've built yourself a sail. Come March, when the gales blow in off Superior, this whole top roof could rip clean off." Antti just nodded. "Maybe," he said. His English was still rough, his accent thick. "We see." That non-answer frustrated his neighbors more than an argument would have. Catherine Fletcher voiced the community's confusion most directly. "Mr. Lahti," she said one afternoon when she encountered him hauling shingles, "I don't mean to pry into your business, but you have 3 children under the age of 7. You're a widower managing this homestead alone. Every board you use for this second roof is a board you can't use for something practical, a proper barn, additional cordwood storage, furniture. Why are you doing this? Auntie's response became the most quoted phrase in the settlement that fall. In Oulu, in Finland, we have long darkness, very cold. My grandfather, his father, they know things about cold, things from before, things that work. But Auntie, Fletcher pressed, we have Swedish families here, Norwegian families. They've come from cold climates too. None of them are building double roofs. Auntie shrugged. They forget maybe, or they never know. Different parts, different knowledge. I remember what my father showed me. Thomas Fletcher, overhearing this exchange from his own property line, later told the men at Swenson's store. The man's relying on folk memory instead of proven American building practices. That's immigrant stubbornness. They come here and refuse to adapt to how we do things properly. What Auntie understood, and what his critics had never considered, was the principle of dead airspace and radiant heat barriers. Heat escapes buildings through three primary mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. In 1883, Minnesota, most homesteaders understood conduction intuitively. They knew that heat flowed through solid materials, which is why they chinked their log walls tight and added sawdust or moss insulation where they could afford it. They had some practical sense of convection, understanding that hot air rises and cold air sinks, which is why they sealed cracks around windows and doors. But almost none of them, even the most experienced builders, properly understood radiant heat loss or how to prevent it. When a wood stove heats a frontier cabin, it warms the interior air through convection and directly heats surfaces through radiation. That warm air rises to the ceiling, where it contacts the underside of the roof structure. In a conventional single-roof cabin, that roof structure is your only barrier between the warm interior and the frigid exterior. Heat conducts through the wood decking and shingles. More significantly, the underside of the roof radiates heat outward. Heat energy transfers from the warmer surface to any cooler surface it faces, including the night sky, which can be a heat sink as cold as -60 degrees Fahrenheit in radiative terms, even when the air temperature is merely 0. The result is massive heat loss through the roof. In Morrison's cabin, in Fletcher's cabin, in Johansson's cabin, and in every other conventional structure in the settlement, 40 to 50% of all the heat energy generated by their wood stoves escaped through the roof. They'd burn 4 cords of wood that winter, trying to maintain interior temperatures. They'd wake to frost on the interior walls. They'd huddle close to the stove while the cabin's far corners remained bitterly cold. Auntie's double roof system attacked this problem through a principle used in Finnish architecture for centuries, but rarely exported to America: the creation of a radiant barrier through dead airspace. The 18-inch gap between his 2 roofs created an insulating layer of trapped air. Air is an excellent insulator when it's immobilized. It has a thermal conductivity of only 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin, compared to wood's 0.12. But that's only part of the genius. The upper roof absorbed and deflected radiant heat from the lower roof. When the underside of Auntie's interior roof warmed up from the cabin's heated air, it radiated heat energy upward. But instead of that radiation escaping to the night sky, it encountered the underside of the upper roof deck just 18 inches away. That upper roof absorbed some of the radiation and reflected some back downward. The airspace between the roofs then warmed slightly, creating a thermal buffer zone. The exterior-facing upper roof still radiated heat to the night sky, but it was radiating heat that had already been significantly reduced by the air gap and the double surface barrier. The thermal efficiency was extraordinary. In technical terms, Auntie had created an R value of approximately 8 to 10 for his roof assembly, compared to an R value of roughly 2 to 3 for a conventional single roof of the same materials. That's nearly 4 times the insulating capacity. The temperature differential was even more dramatic. If the interior ceiling of Morrison's cabin was 65 degrees Fahrenheit and his attic space immediately above was 20 degrees, he was experiencing a 45-degree temperature drop across a few inches of wood. Heat was hemorrhaging out. In Auntie's cabin,
If his interior ceiling was 65 degrees, the airspace between his roofs might equilibrate at 45 degrees, and only then would heat begin escaping through the upper roof to the exterior.
He'd effectively added a thermal buffer that cut his heat loss by more than half. The beauty of the system was that it required no exotic materials, no complicated maintenance, no ongoing expense beyond the initial construction cost. Once built, it was permanent and passive. No moving parts, nothing to adjust. The laws of physics did all the work automatically. Morrison was partially right that the double roof added weight, roughly 800 pounds of additional lumber and shingles. But Ante had engineered his support posts and primary frame to handle the load with a safety margin. He'd calculated, based on his grandfather's teachings and his own practical experience in Oulu, that Minnesota snowfall wouldn't exceed what he'd dealt with in Finland. His structure could handle 6 feet of snow accumulation on both roofs simultaneously, far more than Minnesota typically received. Fletcher was partially right that the double roof increased wind exposure. But the 18-inch separation also meant that wind pressure on the upper roof didn't directly transfer to the main structure. The support posts flexed slightly, absorbing and dissipating wind force. And Ante had oriented his cabin with the roof ridge running northeast to southwest, parallel to the prevailing winter winds from Lake Superior. The wind flowed over and around his roofs with minimal resistance. Johansson's objection about cost was more valid. Ante had used an additional 340 board feet of lumber, roughly 2,800 extra shingles, and probably 60 more hours of labor. In purely economic terms, that represented about $23 worth of materials and a week and a half of work time. For a struggling homesteader, that was significant. But Ante's calculation was different. $23 of extra materials would save him 2 full cords of wood every winter. Wood he wouldn't have to cut, haul, split, and stack. At his labor rate, 2 cords represented about 80 hours of work. The double roof would pay for itself in saved labor within 1 winter season. December 28, 1883. The cold front that meteorologists would later call the Northwestern Blizzard of 1883 slammed into Minnesota with a savagery that old-timers said they'd never witnessed. Temperatures that had hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit on December 27th plummeted to negative 32 degrees by the morning of December 29th. Wind gusts exceeded 50 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to negative 75 degrees. The blizzard dumped 23 inches of snow in 36 hours. Then, the temperature continued falling. By January 2, 1884, Duluth recorded negative 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rural settlements north of the city were even colder. Negative 45 to negative 48 degrees in the exposed clearings where the homesteaders had built their cabins. This wasn't just cold. This was lethal cold. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock in their barns, froze water buckets solid in minutes, made metal tools dangerous to touch with bare hands. This was cold that found every crack, every gap, every weakness in a structure, and exploited it ruthlessly. Samuel Morrison's family suffered first. His cabin, built according to standard Minnesota frontier practices, had walls of chinked logs, a tight-built door, 2 small windows, and a single standard roof over a low attic filled with sawdust insulation. He kept his wood stove burning continuously, feeding it split pine and birch every hour. But the cold was relentless. By December 30th, with the thermometer outside reading negative 38 degrees, Morrison measured the temperature at his children's bedding in the cabin's far corner, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 2 degrees above freezing. His 6-year-old daughter Emma developed a deep cough that night. By New Year's Day, the cough had progressed to what was clearly pneumonia, racking coughs that produced bloody sputum, fever that alternated with violent chills, breathing that sounded wet and labored. Morrison bundled Emma in every blanket they owned and positioned her bedding 18 inches from the wood stove. It was the only place in the cabin warm enough to be survivable. His wife Mary and their other 2 children huddled nearby. The family existed in a 6-foot radius around the stove while the rest of their cabin became essentially uninhabitable. Morrison burned through his entire January wood supply in the first 4 days of January, trying to keep his daughter alive. He'd estimated 2 cords would last the month. He burned 2 cords in 96 hours. He was going through roughly 200 pounds of firewood every 24 hours, cutting into his February and March reserves. And still, Emma struggled. The Fletcher family faced a different crisis. Their cabin had better initial construction. Thomas Fletcher had hired a professional carpenter from Duluth to supervise the building, ensuring tight joints and proper chinking. But no amount of craftsmanship could overcome the fundamental physics of heat loss. By January 3rd, with exterior temperatures at -43 degrees, the Fletchers measured their interior temperature at 41 degrees, despite burning their stove constantly. Catherine Fletcher's 64-year-old father, who'd come to live with them after his wife's death, developed severe hypothermia symptoms. He became confused and lethargic, his speech slurred, his movements uncoordinated. They recognized the signs from medical pamphlets. His core temperature was dropping dangerously despite being indoors. Thomas Fletcher made a desperate decision. He fired up their cook stove in addition to the heating stove, running both simultaneously, and damned the wood consumption. 2 stoves managed to raise the interior temperature to 52 degrees. It was enough to stabilize the old man, but barely. The Fletchers were now burning through wood at a rate that would exhaust their supply by mid-February, leaving them with no fuel for the remainder of winter. Magnus Johansson's situation grew critical when his youngest son, 4-year-old Eric, fell ill. The boy had been playing near the cabin wall on January 4th, away from the stove because the area near the fire had become uncomfortably hot, while the rest of the cabin remained freezing. Eric's activity level dropped. He became listless. By evening, his lips had taken on a bluish tint, the early signs of hypothermia in a child. Johansson's wife, Sigrid, made the same choice Morrison had made. She moved Eric's bedding to within arm's reach of the wood stove and kept him there. The family's living space contracted to 8 feet by 8 feet. 3 children, 2 adults, all their daily activities compressed into 64 square feet, because the other 384 square feet of their cabin were too cold for sustained human habitation. Meanwhile, 200 yards away across the frozen settlement, Auntie Lottie's cabin told a completely different story. On the morning of December 30th, with the blizzard still howling and exterior temperatures at -38 degrees, Auntie's 3 children, Mikko, age 6, Lisa, age 4, and Tuomas, age 3, woke in their beds at the far end of the cabin, 14 feet from the wood stove. They dressed without hurrying, walked across the cabin floor in their stockinged feet, and sat down to a breakfast of porridge at the table. The cabin's interior temperature was 61 degrees Fahrenheit, not 61 degrees near the stove, 61 degrees in the coldest corner of the room where the children slept. Auntie was burning wood at a measured, sustainable pace, roughly 80 pounds per day, less than half of what Morrison was consuming. His wood supply for January wasn't in danger. His children weren't sick. His cabin wasn't divided into a survivable zone near the stove and an uninhabitable zone everywhere else. The space was evenly heated, comfortably warm, and completely safe. On January the 2nd, when the temperature dropped to -45 degrees, Samuel Morrison knocked on Auntie's door. Morrison looked haggard, exhausted from splitting wood every waking hour and sleeping in brief shifts to maintain his fire. His daughter Emma was still gravely ill despite his best efforts. He'd come to ask if Auntie could spare any firewood. Morrison had already burned through his February reserves and was starting to panic about March. Auntie invited him inside. Morrison stepped into the cabin and stopped. He looked around in disbelief. "It's warm," he said. "Auntie, it's actually warm in here." "How is this warm?" Auntie walked to the shelf where he kept his thermometer, a mercury instrument he'd brought from Finland. He held it up so Morrison could read it. 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Morrison stared at the thermometer, then at the wood stove, which was burning steadily, but not aggressively. "What are you doing differently? Are you burning pine, better birch? How much wood are you going through?" "Same wood as you," Auntie said. Maybe 3 cords for whole winter, maybe less. Morrison couldn't process this. He was burning 2 cords per week. Auntie was projecting 3 cords for an entire 4-month winter. That's not possible. You've got 3 kids. I've got 3 kids. Similar cabin size. Similar stove. How are you burning 1/10 the wood I am and staying twice as warm? Auntie pointed upward at his ceiling. The roof, he said simply. Morrison looked up. The ceiling looked normal. Pine boards, neatly joined. I don't understand. What about your roof? You remember? The second roof. You say it is waste. Morrison did remember. Suddenly, standing in this impossibly warm cabin while his own family was freezing, the memory of mocking that second roof felt like ash in his mouth. The second roof does this. That 18 inches of air does this? Yes, Auntie said. Heat it tries to leave. Goes up. But second roof it stops. Heat stays inside. Not perfect, but much better. Very much better. Before we continue with how this revelation spread through the settlement and saved lives that winter, if you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and comment below telling me what traditional building technique from your culture or region you think modern builders should rediscover. Morrison went straight to Thomas Fletcher's cabin and told him what he'd seen. Fletcher was skeptical until Morrison insisted they both go back and verify the temperature with their own eyes. Fletcher brought his own thermometer. They measured 62 degrees in Auntie's cabin, while the exterior temperature was negative 41 degrees. The differential was 103 degrees. Fletcher went home and measured his own cabin. 48 degrees interior, negative 41 exterior, a differential of only 89 degrees despite running 2 stoves simultaneously and burning wood twice as fast as Auntie. The math was irrefutable. The empirical evidence became impossible to deny when Magnus Johansson conducted a systematic comparison over 48 hours starting January 5th. Johansson had been a ship's carpenter before homesteading and understood measurement and documentation. He proposed a controlled test that would eliminate any variables except the roof design. He measured the interior volume of his cabin and Auntie's cabin. His was 576 cubic feet. Auntie's was 612 cubic feet, close enough for meaningful comparison. He verified that both families were running similar wood stoves from the same manufacturer, Acme Stove Works, out of Chicago. He confirmed that both families were burning the same type of wood, split birch, and measured the dimensions of the splits to ensure they were comparable. Then, over 2 days and nights, he recorded temperature measurements every 4 hours and tracked wood consumption by weighing each piece before it went into the stove. The results were stark. Johansson's cabin, with conventional single-roof construction, required 87 pounds of birch per day to maintain an average interior temperature of 53 degrees Fahrenheit when the exterior temperature averaged negative 39 degrees. That's a differential of 92 degrees at a cost of 87 pounds of fuel. Auntie's cabin, with the double roof system, required 41 pounds of birch per day to maintain an average interior temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit when the exterior temperature averaged negative 39 degrees. That's a differential of 100 degrees at a cost of 41 pounds of fuel. Auntie was achieving an 8-degree higher interior temperature while burning 53% less wood. The thermal efficiency improvement was 1 times better. Auntie's cabin was more than twice as efficient as the conventional design. Johansson documented everything in a written report that he posted at Swenson's General Store. The numbers were undeniable. 17 homesteading families in the immediate settlement read that report. Within 36 hours, 14 of them had visited Auntie's cabin personally to examine the double roof construction and verify Johansson's measurements with their own thermometers. Thomas Fletcher took Auntie aside on January 8th and said words that couldn't have been easy for a man who'd publicly called the design damn foolishness. I was wrong, Fletcher said. This works. This works better than anything I've seen, and I've built in 3 states. Would you be willing to show me exactly how you constructed it? I want to add a second roof to my cabin before February. Auntie didn't gloat. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't demand any acknowledgement of who'd been right and who'd been wrong. He just nodded and said, "Yes, I show you. Tomorrow we start." Over the next 6 days, Auntie walked Fletcher through every detail of the construction process. The sizing of the support posts, they needed to be substantial enough to handle the roof weight plus snow load, which meant 8-inch square timbers spaced every 4 feet. The height of the air gap, 18 inches, was optimal. Less than 12 inches didn't provide enough insulating volume, and more than 24 inches added weight without proportional benefit. The importance of sealing the edges, the airspace between the roofs needed to be enclosed at the eaves and gables to prevent wind from blowing through the cavity and eliminating the insulating effect. The ventilation considerations, small vents at the ridge and eaves, allowed minimal airflow to prevent moisture accumulation, but not enough to significantly reduce insulation. Fletcher took notes on everything. He asked technical questions about load calculations, rafter dimensions, and shingle overlapping. Auntie answered each question patiently, often drawing diagrams in the snow with a stick to illustrate structural principles. On January 15th, Fletcher began construction of his second roof. Morrison started his on January 17th. Johansson, working with 2 other Swedish families who'd pooled their labor, started 3 separate double roof additions on January 19th. The construction boom spread through the settlement. By February 1st, 19 families had either completed or begun work on double roof systems. The settlement's sawmill, which typically saw slack demand in January and February, ran at full capacity. The lumber demand became a minor economic stimulus for the community. Emma Morrison recovered. Her pneumonia symptoms began improving on January 10th, 3 days after her father completed enough of the second roof to create a functional air gap over half their cabin. The warmer, more stable interior temperature allowed her body to fight the infection. By January 20th, she was up and active again. Catherine Fletcher's father stabilized and regained his strength as their cabin's temperature rose from the low 40s to the high 50s after their double roof was completed. Young Eric Johansson's hypothermia symptoms disappeared within 24 hours of his family's second roof going on. The double roof innovation didn't just improve comfort, it directly saved lives that winter. The wood savings were equally dramatic. Morrison calculated that his double roof, completed January 17th, would save him 8 cords of wood over the remainder of winter. At his labor rate of 40 hours per cord for cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking, that represented 112 hours of work he didn't have to do. The Fletchers saved 3.1 cords. Johansson saved 2.5 cords. Across the settlement, the double-roof cabins collectively saved an estimated 47 cords of wood that winter, wood that didn't need to be cut from the forest, reducing environmental impact and preserving timber resources. Word spread beyond the immediate settlement. By late February, homesteaders from communities 30 and 40 miles away were traveling to examine Auntie's original construction. A frontier newspaper, the Duluth Weekly Tribune, sent a reporter who interviewed Auntie and published an article on March 6, 1884, titled, "Finnish Immigrants' Roof Design Proves Superior in Brutal Winter." The article included technical drawings and measurements, spreading the knowledge across Minnesota and into Wisconsin. The adoption of double roof construction accelerated through 1884 and into 1885. The settlement north of Duluth saw 43 cabins retrofitted with double roofs by the spring of 1885. New construction increasingly incorporated the design from the outset rather than adding it later. Carpenters who'd initially dismissed Auntie's approach as immigrant eccentricity now actively recommended double roofs to their clients. Some builders developed variations on the design. A Norwegian homesteader named Olaf Bergström built a double roof with a 24-inch air gap instead of 18 inches, theorizing that more insulation was better. He discovered that the additional 6 inches provided marginal improvement, maybe 5% better thermal performance, but increased construction costs and weight by 20%. The 18-inch design was more efficient. A German immigrant family, the Schultzes, tried filling the air gap with loose hay as additional insulation. This proved disastrous. The hay compressed under its own weight, reducing the effective air gap to less than 6 inches. Worse, the hay absorbed moisture and began rotting, creating foul odors and attracting rodents. They removed the hay after one season and went back to Auntie's original empty air gap design. The learning was important. Dead air space worked precisely because it was dead air, not because it was filled with material. A carpenter in Duluth named James Whitmore began offering double roof construction as a premium service. He charged $35 extra for the addition, marketed it as Finnish insulation technology, and found ready customers among the town's more affluent residents. Whitmore made one significant innovation. He painted the underside of the upper roof with whitewash, increasing its reflectivity. This enhanced the radiant barrier effect, bouncing even more heat back toward the interior. Auntie examined Whitmore's modification and approved. "Smart," he said. "Works better." The whitewash addition became standard practice. Economic studies conducted by the territorial government in 1886 documented the impact. Households with double roof systems saved an average of 2.7 cords of wood per winter compared to conventional single-roof homes of similar size. At the territorial average of $4.50 per cord delivered, that represented $12.15 in annual savings. The construction cost of adding a double roof averaged $28. The payback period was 2.3 years, after which it was pure savings year after year. Over a 20-year period, a reasonable lifespan for a frontier home, a double roof system would save $243 in fuel costs. That was substantial money for homesteading families. The fuel savings had broader implications. Reduced wood consumption meant less pressure on local forests. Areas around settlements that might have been completely deforested by aggressive cutting for heating fuel retained more timber. This preserved watershed integrity, wildlife habitat, and future timber resources. Unintentionally, Auntie's thermal efficiency innovation had environmental conservation benefits. Former skeptics became advocates. Thomas Fletcher wrote an article for a territorial homesteading guide in 1885, explicitly crediting Auntie's design and encouraging new settlers to incorporate double roofs from the start. "I initially dismissed this technique as foreign ignorance," Fletcher wrote. "I was the ignorant one. The double roof system represents traditional knowledge that our modern American building practices had foolishly abandoned. We would do well to study what immigrants bring with them rather than assume our ways are automatically superior." Samuel Morrison became something of an evangelist for the design. He helped 11 neighboring families retrofit their cabins, donating his labor for free on weekends. When asked why, he said simply, "Auntie saved my daughter's life. The least I can do is make sure other families don't suffer what we suffered." Magnus Johansson refined the construction process and published a detailed builder's guide in 1886. His manual, Practical Double Roof Construction for Northern Climates, included measurements, materials lists, load calculations, and step-by-step instructions. It sold 340 copies throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Dakota Territory at 25 cents each. Johansson sent Auntie half the proceeds, $42.50, as recognition that the knowledge originated with him. Auntie tried to refuse the money, saying the knowledge had been his grandfather's, not his. Johansson insisted. "Your grandfather shared it with you. You shared it with us. Now we share the benefit. That's how knowledge should work." Auntie Lottie died on August 17, 1908, at the age of 61, from complications of pneumonia. He'd lived long enough to see double roof construction become standard practice throughout northern Minnesota and parts of Wisconsin. He'd lived to see his children, Miko, Lisa, and Tuomas, grow to adulthood, marry, and establish their own homesteads, each with double roof cabins. His original cabin, built in 1883, stood until 1964, when it was finally demolished to make way for a county road expansion. But the double roof principle didn't die. Modern building science has validated Auntie's ancestral knowledge with precise measurements and theoretical models. Contemporary research on radiant barriers and air gap insulation confirms exactly what Auntie understood intuitively and what his Finnish grandfather had known empirically. A 2018 study by the Cold Climate Building Research Center at the University of Minnesota documented that radiant barrier roof systems with 18-inch air gaps can reduce heat loss by 45 to 52% compared to conventional attic insulation of equivalent cost. The study didn't mention Antti Lahti by name, but it proved his grandfather's wisdom with laboratory instruments and computer models. The principle survives in modern construction techniques. Radiant barrier sheathing is now a standard option in residential roofing. The concept of creating dead air spaces for insulation underlies modern double-wall construction, structural insulated panels, and ventilated rain screen systems. What changed is that we've formalized and industrialized what Antti did with rough-cut timber and practical knowledge. We've made it more consistent, more precise, more scalable. But the fundamental physics, that dead airspace and radiant barriers dramatically reduce heat loss, remains exactly what Antti's grandfather taught him in Oulu, decades before anyone had written research papers about R values and thermal bridging. The near loss of this knowledge is a warning. How many other traditional building techniques, refined over centuries in harsh climates, have been dismissed as primitive or backward by people who assumed modern methods were automatically superior? How many immigrants arrived in America with practical wisdom about cold climate construction, hot climate ventilation, moisture management, or structural durability, only to be told their methods were wrong? We almost lost the double roof principle because educated American builders thought they knew better than a Finnish homesteader. We almost lost it because Thomas Fletcher assumed his Boston-influenced construction knowledge was superior. We almost lost it because Samuel Morrison trusted conventional wisdom over direct evidence. We almost lost it because Magnus Johansson, even coming from Sweden, had never learned this particular regional technique. We nearly let children die because we were too arrogant to consider that an immigrant might understand something we'd forgotten or never learned. Today, there's a historical marker on County Road 7 north of Duluth, approximately where Antti's cabin once stood. The marker, installed in 1996 by the Minnesota Historical Society, reads, "Near this site, Finnish immigrant Antti Lahti built a double-roof cabin in 1883 using traditional Scandinavian thermal design principles. His construction methods, initially ridiculed by neighbors, proved dramatically superior during the severe winter of 1883-84 and saved numerous lives. Lahti's design influenced cold climate construction throughout the region and contributed to modern understanding of radiant heat barriers. His willingness to share his knowledge freely exemplifies the immigrant contribution to American innovation." The marker doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't mention Emma Morrison's pneumonia or Eric Johansson's hypothermia. It doesn't quantify the 47 cords of saved wood or the 43 retrofitted cabins. It doesn't capture Thomas Fletcher's humility in admitting error or Samuel Morrison's transformation from skeptic to advocate. It doesn't note that Antti refused payment for his consultations, seeing the shared knowledge as something that belonged to everyone. But it marks the spot. It says, something important happened here. Traditional wisdom proved superior to contemporary arrogance. An immigrant's ancestral knowledge saved an American settlement. That message matters. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. How many other pieces of traditional knowledge are we dismissing right now because they seem strange or old-fashioned? How many climate-adapted designs, refined over generations, are we losing because we think modern methods are always better? Next time, we're diving into the Norwegian immigrant who built an underground food storage system in North Dakota that maintained 34 degrees year-round without any mechanical cooling, and how the local farmers called him crazy until the summer of 1889 hit. 108 degrees and all their food spoiled while his stayed perfectly preserved. Until then, remember, sometimes the person who seems to be doing things backward is actually the one looking forward.